This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. One of my goals with this series is ultimately to do a top 10 on every single set, and I've already done a lot of them, and we'll be doing another one today with a look at Throne of Eldraine. It's just about to rotate out of Standard, so I thought it would be a good time to take a look at where the set stands now. The general consensus about Eldraine is that it is one of the more powerful sets we've seen in recent years, and I think we'll see that consensus supported in this MTG Top 10, which is pretty darn stacked. In fact, Eldraine was so powerful and dominated Standard so much that Wizards decided to jump ahead to Standard 2022 on Magic Arena. Since the format will change so drastically once the powerful cards from Eldraine are no longer legal in the format. To be eligible for this list, a card had to receive its very first printing in Throne of Eldraine. 269 cards meet that requirement, and in this video we'll talk about the 10 of them that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. Alright, let's get to the list. At number 10, I have 2 cards, but that's because they are largely joined at the hip, and that's Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven. These 2 cards combine to form the core of a variety of black, red, and Jund Sacrifice decks in both Standard and Historic over the last couple of years. If you have them both in play, you can sacrifice the Familiar to the Oven and then sacrifice the food to get the Familiar back every single turn, giving you some serious inevitability, and a creature that can just come back and block every single turn while gaining you life and taking life away from your opponent. On top of that, these decks also run tons of sacrifice payoffs, like Mayhem Devil and Corvold, which produced all kinds of additional value every time you did this, since you were sacrificing 2 permanents each time. The deck was so powerful in Standard that Cauldron Familiar was ultimately banned in the format in August of 2020. The Oven actually picked up a top 8 at the Kaldheim Championship even without the Familiar, so that's why it actually has 2 more points. Obviously though, the banning definitely put a damper on the ability of the Familiar and the Oven to gain more points in Standard, but sacrifice decks did find more success in Historic, and the 2 may even have a future in Modern, where food decks are on the rise with the release of Modern Horizons 2. At number 9, it is Ember Cleave. This powerful equipment has been a key card in many aggro decks ever since Throne of Eldraine came out. In such decks, casting the Cleave for very little mana is a piece of cake, and putting this on a creature at instant speed either results in massive damage to the opponent, or a blocker getting run over, or both. Right now, Ember Cleave doesn't actually have any points outside of Standard. It is played in some Historic decks, but none of them have top 8'd so far. If things continue this way, Ember Cleave may fall off of this list in the long run, as there are many other powerful Eldraine cards in the set that aren't all that far behind it, like Murderous Rider and Questing Beast. At number 8, it is Love-Struck Beast. Adventure was one of the signature mechanics of Eldraine, and it has made quite the impact on competitive Magic. Cards with Adventure give you a ton of flexibility and value. In this case, you can pay 1 mana to get a 1/1, and then 3 mana for a 5/5. These can be your turn 1 and 3 plays respectively, really helping you curve out with only a single card. And of course, the Beast is absolutely massive for the cost, and because it made a 1/1 to begin with, meeting the requirement for it to attack isn't exactly difficult. The Beast has gained a ton of points in its time in Standard, largely as a result of basically always having a home in the format. This included a variety of more traditional aggro decks that have green in them, like Selesnya, Gruul, Naya, and so forth, as well as adventure decks, which would combine powerful adventure creatures with adventure payoffs like Lucky Clover and Edgewall Innkeeper. He also has a single top 8 that came in a Historic Jund Sacrifice deck. He seems to have a reasonable shot at finding some success outside of Standard, though his future doesn't look quite as bright as most of the cards that are ahead of it on this list. At number 7, it's Once Upon a Time. This might look like a green Anticipate, but the upside of being free when it's the first spell you cast in a game is huge, since it gives you such massive card selection with a look at the top 5 cards of your library. It helped to make green decks way too good and way more consistent across all of Magic's formats. In fact, the card ultimately had to be banned in Standard, Historic, and Modern, and this happened way back in 2019. Despite those long-standing bannings that certainly suppressed its score in those 3 formats, it gained plenty of points in the brief time it was legal in them, especially in Standard, and it's also gone on to find significant success in Magic's Eternal formats. it's going to continue to amass points in those formats, but it's pretty likely that that's true for all the cards ahead of it on this list too. At number 6, it is yet another green card, Gilded Goose. We've already seen food appear on this list, and we've got more of it with Gilded Goose, a mana dork that can consume food to give you mana, in addition to having the ability to produce additional food tokens. 1-mana creatures that can tap for mana of any color have a pretty good track record in Magic, and Gilded Goose has followed that trend by seeing play in every format but Vintage. Both aggro and control decks tend to like a card like this, as both decks are very interested in accelerating their mana in the early game. While the bulk of its points have come in Standard, it has already seen significant play outside of it. In Pioneer, all its points have come in Simic aggro decks. In Historic, it gained all its points in Jund Sacrifice decks. And in Legacy, it's gained all of its points in Bug midrange. Like most of the cards on this list, it will continue to see play even after it rotates out of Standard. At number 5, it is Bone Crusher Giant, another adventure creature. Bone Crusher Giant was so ubiquitous in the Standard he was part of that many creatures who might otherwise be playable in other formats just couldn't be played, since if you had an X2 in your deck, it could just easily get killed by the Giant's adventure, which only cost the opponent half a card, and that just wasn't an advantage you could give to people. Then, once you play the Giant as an actual creature, you end up with something pretty nice, a 3-mana 4/3 that can hit pretty hard, and even if your opponent does kill it, they lose life in the process, so it still puts them under significant pressure. Especially because, again, even if they do kill it, they're basically only dealing with half a card. The Giant was pretty close to a staple in red decks and Standard. It was played in straight-up aggressive red decks and in more adventure-centric decks too. While it isn't quite as format-defining in other formats, and it will certainly slow down once it rotates out of Standard, it has already gained points in Historic, Pioneer, and Modern, so creatures aren't quite done getting their bones crushed just yet. At number 4, it is Brazen Borrower, another adventure creature. This one gives you a bounce spell, and then you get an efficient, aggressive flying body. Both sides of the card have very reasonable costs, and the total package is a pretty incredible deal, as it is basically a better 5-mana 3/1 flyer that bounces something when it enters the battlefield, and that would already be a good card, because tempo is very real, especially when you're adding a real body to the board. It's been pretty close to a staple in Standard, seeing play in a multitude of different kinds of blue decks, with Simic Flash and Wilderness Reclamation decks being its most frequent homes. In addition to being a key card in Standard the whole time it's been there, the Borrower has also been played in Historic Arclight Phoenix decks, Pioneer Spirit decks, Legacy Delver decks, and Vintage Bug. Brazen Borrower looks primed to gain a ton more points even after it rotates out of Standard. At number 3, it is Oko, Thief of Crowns, which is probably the first card that comes to your mind when you think of how incredibly powerful Eldraine is. Oko is one of the most maligned cards released in the last few years, and this is because he was crazy powerful. His abilities are all great. His +1 ability is the most powerful one, as you can use it to turn your opponent's best creature or artifact into a vanilla 3/3. You can also use it on your own stuff, like the food Oko makes to turn things into better creatures. Then his -5 allows you to exchange control of things, like by giving them your food for something that was much better of theirs. Oko was a huge problem and has been played in every single format. He was the most overpowered in Standard, where he was only legal for about 2 months and yet managed to gain 60 points in the format. The peak of his Standard dominance came between August 8th and 10th, when it was in 18 of the 24 decks to top 8 Premier events that weekend. He was ultimately banned out of Standard, Pioneer, Historic, Modern, Legacy, and even Brawl. He's now only legal in Vintage, but despite that limitation, he's still putting up points, and he's plenty powerful for Magic's most powerful format. At number 2, I've got 2 cards, Castle Vantress and Castle Lochthwain. I have them here together because they're part of the same cycle, and I didn't want to give them 2 separate slots. Castle Vantress with its 120 points is a legitimate number 2, while Lochthwain would have been number 7. I know that people sometimes don't like it when lands show up high on these lists, but lands are important, and these 2 in particular are quite powerful. They're part of a whole cycle of castles that came with powerful activated abilities, and they enter tapped unless you control a land with the same type as the color of mana it produces. Getting them to enter untapped really isn't a difficult thing, and when that's true, these are just lands with big upside. In the later part of the game, Vantress allows you to improve your draws with Scry, and Lochthwain just lets you draw cards straight up. That's a pretty big deal, since most of your lands will do stone nothing in the late game unless you draw something to cast with them. Both of these are obviously more well suited to mid-range and control decks, as aggro decks generally don't want to get to the part of the game where these become useful. Both have gained significant points in Standard, Historic, and Pioneer, and they will continue to gain more points going forward. However, they probably won't ever catch the number 1 card on this list, which is Fabled Passage. Another land that some people might not be happy to see at the top of this list, but like Vantress and Locthwain, it's been an important card in Standard and other formats ever since being printed. This strictly better Evolving Wilds can search up any basic land and put it into play. With Evolving Wilds, the land is always tapped, but if you have enough lands, Fabled Passage puts the land into play untapped, and that's a pretty big deal, making it a pretty impressive fetch land. It's helped decks improve their mana bases in Standard, Historic, and Pioneer, and it looks likely that it will continue to do so. Well, those are the 10 Eldraine cards that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic so far. If you want to own any of these powerful cards, you should check the description for this video, where you'll find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that more people can see it. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s and other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at individual sets, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Also, if you like hearing me talk about Magic history, consider also subscribing to my other YouTube channel, History, where I talk about real-world history. Thanks for watching.